Hello, my name is Anastasiia Peleshenko. I'm a master's student of international relations at the Charles University in Prague, and this is a podcast on the US and Russia nuclear arms control regime. This podcast was produced as part of a series on politics of nuclear nonproliferation as a final project for a class under the same title taught by Professor Smetana here at Charles University. Today, I'm going to present a short overview of the historical development of the bilateral nuclear arms control regime between the US and Russia, and then discuss its current and future dynamics with an expert, Alyn Ware. We will consider the question of why this regime is so difficult to regulate and how it can be improved in the future. Let's start at the beginning. The United States of America successfully developed and deployed a nuclear weapon in 1945, and the USSR came around by 1949. The Cold War was in full speed with propaganda and arms races. Since then, nuclear weapons became not only the most devastating weapon, but also a critical political instrument. For both states, more warheads and more powerful nuclear weapons meant more military and also symbolic power to stand against the other bloc. Gradually coming to light was the concept of nuclear deterrence, which simply speaking assures that as long as your arsenal is intimidating enough for your opponent, they would not dare to attack, since the price of possible retaliation would be much higher than any gains. It is, however, also where the idea of the security dilemma comes into play, where one state arming up in perspective makes the other state more vulnerable, leading both into a vicious circle of ever-growing arsenals. With the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles carrying nuclear weapons, or ICBMs, it became clear that if the Cold War were to heat up, it would inevitably turn nuclear. And the Cuban Crisis of October 1962 made this all the more convincing. The event that has really shocked practically the whole world at the end of the day made the logic of deterrence stronger, since both states realized that deploying nuclear weapons meant mutually assured annihilation. This understanding was one of the main factors why the negotiations of a nuclear arms control regime became a top priority. In August 1963, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union have signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, prohibiting nuclear weapons tests or other nuclear explosions underwater, in the atmosphere, or in the outer space. The treaty still allowed underground nuclear tests as long as no radioactive debris fell outside the territory of the nation conducting the test. While it seems minor, considering that the nuclear arsenals of both the US and USSR by then were counted in tens of thousands, the treaty has also, for the first time, pledged signatories to work towards eventual disarmament, towards a stop of the armaments race, and stop to contamination of the environment by radioactive substances. This treaty paved the way for all the consecutive agreements establishing the international nuclear arms control regime, and it has eventually evolved into a comprehensive or complete nuclear test ban treaty. Moreover, in 1965, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was under negotiation, dealing with the big questions of how to treat the states who have already acquired nuclear weapons and how to make sure that their number does not increase. In other words, how to prevent nuclear proliferation. The NPT has established the three pillars of non-proliferation, cooperation in nuclear energy sector, and commitment of nuclear states, including Russia and US, of course, to eventual disarmament. While laying a foundation for the international nuclear weapons control regime, the NPT was not a treaty regulating the US and USSR nuclear weapons, even if it bound both to pursue disarmament eventually. For the rivaling great powers, the only way to begin disarmament was bilateral, so that mutual deterrence and mutual vulnerability remained in place throughout the process. Treaties with that goal became known as Strategic Nuclear Arms Control Agreements. Let's take a look at the complete list. First, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, produced the Anti-Ballistic Missile, or ABM, Treaty, which limited the state's strategic missile defenses, or interceptors. And the so-called interim agreement was produced at the same time in 1972 that capped the number of the US and Soviet missiles, not the warhead number, however. So the arsenals overall continued to increase. Next, SALT II extended the restrictions to the US and Soviet strategic nuclear forces, and even though the treaty never officially entered into force, the states have technically adhered to its provisions. The next treaty, however, was a turning point for the regime. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or the INF Treaty, concerned non-strategic nuclear arms control. And it is currently the only treaty that has effectively eliminated a whole type of nuclear weapons, and by some experts has been called the only actual disarmament treaty. INF has also established an unprecedented verification regime that became a foundation for the next START I treaty, including on-site inspections and monitoring outside the production, storage, repair, and elimination facilities, regular exchange of information and notifications regarding any destroyed or moved systems, but also exchange of data on telemetry, meaning the missile flight test data, and the use of national technical means, which was one of the most common verification methods at the time, which means satellite surveillance, radars, etc. Unfortunately, under Trump administration, the United States have formally withdrew from the INF Treaty in 2019, after the US officials have criticized it for several years, and since 2014, both US and Russia accused each other of treaty violations. And there was certainly a lot of miscommunication and misunderstandings. So as a result, the question of the INF non-strategic arms control and their terms remain an open question on whether or not there could be reintroduced in a future agreement. The INF Treaty was followed by START I, or the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, regulating a different category of nuclear weapons. Both sides committed to reduce their deployed strategic arsenals, as well as capped the number of warheads at 6,000. The verification regime was slightly relaxed compared to the INF, but overall used the same means. Because the treaty was first signed in 1991, the fall of Soviet Union delayed its implementation until 2001, but the treaty remained in place for 8 next years. START II was meant as a follow-up accord and was signed in 1992 already, but by US and Russia. However, the ratification was delayed repeatedly and the treaty was never implemented because the conditions of the Russian Duma were not met by the Senate. And at the same time, later on in 2002, the US withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM, from 1972, and the START II was effectively dismissed. Historically, the negotiations between the US and Russia on the bilateral security agreements have been obstructed by both domestic institutions and states' international interests, which more often than not had to take into account the future repercussions for allies on both sides. As a result, not all the agreements had a robust verification mechanism, such as the SWORD Treaty or the Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty, also referred to as Moscow Treaty. It reduced the strategic arsenals limit and was signed in 2002. The strategic arsenals limit was decreased to 2,200 warheads. And to emphasize, in 1991, the limit was at 6,000. So the new agreement was quite progressive. However, the states have never reached a deal on specific monitoring and counting rules. The treaty didn't even require the destruction of either excess delivery vehicles or warheads, while both INF and START I did. The final treaty, which replaced SWORD in 2011, was the Next START Treaty, a legally binding, verifiable agreement that limits each side to 1,550 strategic nuclear warheads deployed on 700 strategic delivery systems, meaning intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, as well as heavy bombers. It also limits deployed and non-deployed launchers to 800. The treaty was supposed to expire in 2021. However, the negotiations of a new agreement under Trump administration were inconclusive. The administration has repeatedly criticized the treaty. There were discussions of a 1-year extension with a temporary freeze on the number of warheads, but Russia rejected the condition of mutual monitoring of the warhead freeze, and at the end, no deal was reached. Only on February 3rd, 2021, with only 2 days before the expiration of the treaty, the newly elected President Biden and President Putin have agreed to extend the new treaty by 5 years until 2026. The problem is that the text of the treaty only allows one 5 years extension, and this now brings both sides to the negotiation table. Russia and the US have restarted the so-called Strategic Stability Dialogue, which includes, but it is not limited to, the bilateral nuclear arms control regime. Whether this will result in one or several new treaties remains unclear. So far, they were in session twice, in July and September 2021, and the third plenary session is scheduled for early in 2022. In addition to this, 2 working groups were established to delve into details on the issues of importance to both delegations, which continue to work in between the plenary sessions. It is important to note that the dialogue will certainly be affected by the US nuclear posture review planned for early 2022, but also, perhaps more obviously, by the current tensions between the two states from both earlier conflicts and the ongoing conversations about Ukraine, security in Europe, cybersecurity, and the future of their bilateral relations, really beyond nuclear weapons. The whole concept of strategic stability is quite complex for both states, and it is heavily vested in their national security and international interests. Both states remain bound and committed to eventual disarmament under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but naturally, neither state will decrease their arsenal without a decrease on the other side. Russia and the US remain the states with the highest number of nuclear warheads in the world. But due to the variety of issues of strategic stability, the dialogue so far remains full of disagreements and opposing viewpoints, with only a few points of convergence. One of the main questions from the US is the regulation of Russian non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons, a topic that Moscow pretty much has been avoiding or diverting with concerns about the American tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. One of the biggest concerns for Russia, however, is the American anti-missile defense systems, also a topic that was avoided over the years. So an agreement to simply reduce the arsenals further will not be possible. Emerging disruptive technologies such as autonomous platforms and artificial intelligence are also expected to be on the agenda. Beyond nuclear weapons, the strategic security will concern offensive and defensive conventional weapons and prevention of a future arms race in the outer space. This is a list of a lot of questions, maybe even too many questions for the environment of high tensions, lack of trust, and unpredictability in the relations between US and Russia, which by some experts has already been labeled as the new Cold War. So how can this process be successful and get us closer to a world with less nuclear weapons? I've asked this question to the expert in the areas of peace, nonviolence, nuclear abolition, and international law, Alyn Ware.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to do this podcast with you. My name is Alyn Ware. I'm originally from New Zealand. I'm now living in the Czech Republic. And my background is as both an educator, lawyer, and international relations person. So I combine the three fields, working primarily on peace and nuclear disarmament and the nuclear weapons issue. So I'm the director of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Disarmament, international network of parliamentarians, and the co-founder of No First Use Global, which is advancing the idea of no first use policies as being an important incremental step to a nuclear weapons-free world.
Just a quick note here, since the interview was taking place on the 5th of January, which was supposed to be the second day of the 10th review conference of the NPT Treaty, which was postponed to August this year, we begin our conversation with the question of what is happening now that the conference has been postponed and how this will affect the future negotiations between Russia and the US.
So the meeting itself has been postponed, but the preparatory work and the key negotiations and the issues are going to continue. So, for example, just 2 days ago, the 5 nuclear weapon states that are parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty released their joint statement, which they had prepared for the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. And they deemed, and I think they deemed correctly, that what they were trying to pull together in terms of the joint understanding, mutual understanding and cooperation between the nuclear weapon states was important at this point in time, regardless of whether the NPT review conference has been held. And similarly, the other states parties to the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, who have been advancing particular initiatives, are going to keep advancing those. They will be having discussions. They will be contributing their ideas to various policy review processes. So the work will continue, even though the review conference itself won't take place until August.
That's good to hear, definitely. And of course, it makes sense. And so then this is on the multilateral process as it's happening right now. But there is also the process between Russia and the US, specifically negotiating and engaging in the so-called strategic stability dialogues, which have had 2 sessions, I believe, until now, and they're planning to reconvene soon at the beginning of this year. So these negotiations obviously had many concerns from both sides, and in my understanding so far, they haven't had many points of agreement. However, hopefully they're working on it. And so what do you believe are the main challenges in this negotiation process as of today?
Well, firstly, it is a positive sign that the United States and Russia agreed to re-energize, should I say, the strategic stability dialogue. It's not a new thing. I mean, there have been various manifestations of it in the past, but it had been, in a sense, gone cold with the increased tensions between the two countries, with misunderstandings, with claims and counterclaims. And so to get back on track with the strategic dialogue is really important. As you mentioned, there are many issues to deal with. This is, the name gives you the idea, strategic stability. I mean, there are a lot of conflicts that are happening. There are a lot of issues that aren't just related to the nuclear weapons and what are the different nuclear weapon systems that are being produced and what might be the implications of those weapon systems. In fact, the real problems lie not in the weapons themselves, but in these unresolved conflicts. And there are a number of them. It's not just one. There is, of course, a territorial authority disputes. The annexation by Russia of Crimea, which from the Russians believe that was an appropriate move by Russia. It was the territory which had originally been given to Ukraine on the basis of the understanding, that there would be this continuing relationship, security relationship between Ukraine and Russia. They had a referendum there, 95%, I think, supported that that Crimea would be returned in terms of management to Russia. So from the Russian side, they believe they did everything correctly, but from others' perspective, this is not the way that you can change, territorial delineation, management authority, and that has to go through a proper legal process, which is not just determined by majority vote in the country, and so that is one of the core disputes which is festering. And while that still remains, just tinkering with what the weapons are is not going to be enough. And it's not just Crimea, it's also the situation of Ukraine itself, where there are very different opinions from both sides. Should I say both sides? From at least 2 sides, the Western side and the Russian side, about what's the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government and what created the crisis that led to the departure of the elected president, who was pro-Russian, and then a new government being installed, which was pro-West, and a splitting of the country between those who support better, closer relations, economic and military relations with the West, and those who support a strong economic and military relations with Russia. And the fact that it was split into that question, as opposed to how can we move on a more cooperative security relationship that involves relations with both West and Russia, you can lay blame on both sides, and in order to resolve it, the perspectives of both sides are going to need to be dealt with. I lay this out because, as I said, the nuclear weapons are a political response to unresolved conflicts between those countries that have the nuclear weapons and also others that don't have them but are either allied, or have relationships with those with the nuclear weapons. So the strategic stability dialogue has to deal somewhat with that as well as with the weapons themselves. Otherwise, they're not going to get agreement. There will be a continuing reliance on new weapon systems as a way of protecting national security and security of allies from both sides, while these conflicts continue to fester. So I see that they have to be done hand in hand with an approach that, even if it can't resolve those conflicts right now, because they're very difficult ones, at least to be able to manage them in a better way, to enable confidence from both sides that the conflicts are not going to escalate. And we don't have that at the moment. We've seen Russian troops on the border of the Ukraine, a lot of concern from the West, more troops coming in to support Ukrainian troops, from some of the Western countries, with concern that this could erupt, that the low-level conflict, which is at the moment in eastern Ukraine, could escalate into a full war. With that situation there, looking at the nuclear weapons, you're not going to get very far in strategic stability dialogue. And we're talking about Russia and the United States, but they're not the only two players in this equation. Looking at the United States, they are also casting on, across in the other direction towards Northeast Asia. They have concerns about Korea. They have concerns about China. They have security relationships with Japan and South Korea. Strong security relationships, which include, the extended nuclear deterrence. So the United States, their weapons, the nuclear weapons they have, are serving multiple roles. It's not just, a containment of Russia. In a sense, back in the Cold War, it was a little bit easier because there was primarily two power blocks that had the most nuclear weapons, and that the nuclear equation was pretty much determined. The main nuclear equation was pretty much determined by the Soviet Union and the United States. Now it's much more multidimensional. And so while as I said, it's good that there's a strategic stability dialogue going between Russia and the United States, there also needs to be something similar between the United States and China. And there are indications that there is sort of a willingness of China and the United States to proceed with that, and that will be a helpful thing. So I mentioned that. And again, the Ukraine is not also in isolation. I mean, it's part of a broader security framework after the end of the Soviet Union, where from the Russian side, their perspective, as we've heard from Gorbachev, for example, was that the predominant security framework for Europe would shift to the OSCE, to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is, as I said, a common security framework. Russia, the former Soviet countries, are part of the OSCE. All of the European countries are part of it, not just the NATO countries, and also the US and Canada. And the approach that the OSCE is taking is set a common security framework. It's looking at how do you manage and resolve conflicts, how do you build negotiations between the different parties that are involved in the conflicts, how do you deal with issues which might give rise to conflicts, and that includes human rights issues, includes democracy issues. They're all sort of encapsulated into the OSCE framework. And in the OSCE, there is a capacity to address the security concerns of all parties involved. That's quite different to placing your primary security framework on a military alliance like NATO. And I think it was quite disconcerting from the Russian perspective that this understanding, from Russia, that they had understood that the predominant security framework would shift to the OSCE, but instead what happened was that NATO expanded and more countries joined NATO, coming closer and closer to Russia. That changed the security thinking from the Russian side to one more of a, oh dear, we see these threats coming closer to us. And so therefore we have to move back to a stronger military approach and more of a fortress mentality to ensure our security. So one can understand, of course, why those former Soviet bloc countries were interested in joining NATO. Some of them had been dealt with really badly under the Soviet Union. And of course, they have a right to develop security arrangements that they feel is necessary. But the impact of them elevating, the West elevating NATO and not elevating the OSCE has had these bad repercussions. And that's part of the problem that we're seeing with a much more aggressive Russia. It's not just that, or as some may perceive, it's not specifically that Russia had designs of being an imperialist power. It was from their perspective, they had security threats that were increasing. So one needs to address these issues. It doesn't mean that you stop countries from joining NATO, but you have to do it sensitively, and you have to be very careful, and you have to ensure that the common security framework is elevated. We need to give more support to the OSCE. We need to give more support to common security mechanisms, and not place the predominant security framework on the military approach, which can be seen as threatening, whether it's from the NATO side, which is seen as threatening from Russia, or from the Russian side, Russia, which NATO countries can see as threatening. So it needs to be on both sides, instead a shift towards more of the common security approach. The OSCE, when it's given resources, it can do a good job. It's had many successes in terms of election monitoring, helping democratic process, human rights monitoring, even in some conflict mediation, negotiations. But as I said, because it's not given enough political status, also economic support. The amount of money that goes into NATO and military approaches to security is huge compared to the amount of money. But it's more the political status that's given to these. So OSCE does well on a limited status and a limited budget and limited resources. It could do even better if there was more invested in it. I apologize that that's a long answer to the question. But it also, those ideas and principles that I've been relating also relate not just to Ukraine, but some of the other conflicts. It's not just the Ukraine that there are tensions. There's other, former Soviet bloc countries that also have historical disputes, with Russia, and that's feeding into this dynamic that we have at the moment that is not making it easy to make progress on nuclear disarmament.
Definitely, yes. I really have been following the current dialogue. Well, first, I'm Ukrainian, so that's a big concern for me, but also because it is very interesting how this is developing. And of course, it is valid to acknowledge the Russian concerns about national security, sure. However, the standard spin of the narrative, creating and reacting to any proposals in the national frame is making it still quite difficult. So really this maintenance of the narrative in Russia that is not necessarily always considered abroad is still keeping this environment of uncertainty and this tense situation where maybe Russia will cooperate, maybe not. And I think it's still in their interest to keep this level of uncertainty, and how this will affect the negotiations on any resolutions, also on the nuclear ones, is probably will be very interesting. And in their negotiations, well, in the conversation they had about Ukraine, the strategic stability concerns have come up anyways. And I really agree that it has to come hand in hand, not necessarily dealing with Ukraine in particular, but resolving these tensions overall. So I absolutely agree. And my interest in that was also whether this current lack of trust that is observed in this kind of relations and negotiations, if in the future it could actually push for a more robust or more better verifiable treaty somehow, if maybe they will have to make more assurances for each other.
Well, one should not rest all the ideas of what will be successful and what ensures progress on the idea of a new treaty. While in my mind, treaties are the best option because they are clear agreements. Well, that's the idea of it. You clarify exactly what are the obligations of both sides, both positive and negative obligations. What you need to do and what you're not allowed to do. There's clarity in them, and in treaties is also generally, a process to ensure implementation. We have a problem with some of the development of the treaties, and it's from both. We're talking bilaterally here, the US and Russia, and on both sides. From the US side, there's a lot of difficulties in actually getting treaties now ratified by US Congress because of the very bipartisan split in the Congress. And so if you have a Democratic president putting forward an arms control or disarmament treaty to be ratified in the US Congress, it's very difficult to get even one Republican vote for it, which is why Obama found it very difficult. He managed to get one treaty ratified in this field, which was the New START agreement, but at a huge cost. The only way that he could get a handful of Republicans to agree to ratification, and you need, was it 2/3 of the Congress to ratify, so you need a handful of Republicans, was if he accepted a much larger budget for nuclear weapons research, design, and development, which was ridiculous. I mean, here was a new agreement, that Obama had put as one of his principal objectives in the start of his presidency, and he achieved through the negotiations with Russia, difficult negotiations, but with good faith on both sides, they achieved a treaty to lower the number of nuclear weapons. And what does the Congress want to do with that? Oh, you're lowering the number of nuclear weapons, so therefore we have to spend more money on nuclear weapons. Logically, it doesn't make sense. But that's what Obama had to agree to get the Republicans to sign on. I mean, straight away, the Russians were like scratching their heads going, what is this, And immediately there was this perspective from the Russian side that the US was operating in bad faith. They were on paper, agreeing to the New START agreement, but in reality, they were building up the nuclear arsenals, which is sort of, what was happening. Yeah. So we have a similar problem, with the Biden administration, even if, which we've got a presidency under Biden who wants to negotiate treaties, getting a treaty ratified in the US Congress is very difficult. And even if it is, the US Congress is basically very supportive of the weapons industry. And even during the times of the pandemic, even during times of the climate crisis, when budget priorities should be focused on public health, and on moving towards a green economy to ensure protection of workers, protection of the environment, protection of health, protection of security, the Congress members still vote huge amounts for the military budget. It's gone up, not down, and peanuts, very little to what's needed to really address the health and economic aspects of the pandemic and what is required to move to a green economy. The transitional budget, which was required, which will actually end up being economically better in the end, but you have to invest something in the economy to make that shift to a green economy. And the problem that we have there is the weapons industry is so powerful in the United States that their lobbying force captures the legislators. So it makes treaty ratification really, really difficult. So that's where, when we're looking at what progress can be made, we can't just look at a treaty, because we don't even know if the US and Russia administrations agree on the treaty, whether the Congress will ratify it or not. And if they ratify it, what will be the cost of that ratification? So looking at other initiatives is really important. And joint presidential decisions are something which have been done in the past effectively. So there was in 1991, for example, the US and Russia did these reciprocal joint presidential directives on taking weapons, a large number of the weapons off alert, and taking a number of their weapons off operational readiness, put them in storage. They did it without a treaty because both realized it would be very difficult to get the treaty in the US ratified, and they could do it very quickly. in that respect. So reciprocal measures can sometimes be better than treaties. I'm not saying always, but they can sometimes. And that's what we need to look at in this process. What are the range of possibilities of moving ahead? So on reciprocal measures, one of the ones that should be looked at and is getting a lot of attention at the moment is the idea of moving to sole purpose or no first use declaratory policies. These don't need a treaty. These can be joint declarations, from the administrations. In the US context, it would then need to be encapsulated into the Nuclear Posture Review, which ultimately has the presidential authority to sign off. Of course, has to get agreement, which is difficult, from the Defense Department, DOE, Department of Energy, State Department. State Department will probably be much easier to get on board. But it's something which the president can do. And that's something also which, the Russian president could do. So you could get either a joint declaration, of moving to sole purpose or no first use policies, or you get reciprocal declarations. And they could make it either a limited type of no first use policy, like they could do what Russia and China have done, for example, which is China and Russia have developed an agreement that they would not use nuclear weapons first against each other. But Russia still keeps open the option of first use of nuclear weapons in other contexts. The United States and Russia could do something similar to that, for example. And that would be a little easier to obtain through the strategic stability dialogue. A joint declaration that Russia and the United States will not use nuclear weapons first against each other. And the USA can then consider how this may play out with North Korea and China, which is the other field of area that their nuclear weapons have a first use option for. And they don't have to deal with that straight away. They could deal with that in another strategic stability process, for example. So that's an option. Already, there has been a small achievement in the strategic stability dialogue, leading possibly in that direction, and that's the joint affirmation that a nuclear war cannot be won and so must never be fought.
Right.
So the two presidents announced that agreement in June, and then 2 days ago, in the joint statement of the 5 nuclear weapon states that are parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, they also affirmed that dictum, which comes from Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, that a nuclear war cannot be won and so must never be fought. This is important, even if the policies at the moment are not consistent with that dictum. Of course. Which I would argue that the policies are not consistent with that dictum. The fact that they still have options of first use of nuclear weapons, that there are still veiled threats of the use of nuclear weapons in conflict scenarios. There's been a veiled threat by Putin with nuclear weapons in the European context and the Ukraine conflict. There is veiled threats from China of first use of nuclear weapons in the disputes in the South China Sea, even though China has an official no first use policy. They've been do they really mean it? Because they have sort of talked about over Taiwan and others, the possible, don't forget we've got nuclear weapons. So, and these seem to contradict this idea that a nuclear war cannot be won, so must never be fought. But the very fact that they actually have made that statement is really important. It's something we can now hold to the P5, the five nuclear weapon states: China, France, UK, Russia, and the United States. The other nuclear armed states are not parties to the NPT. They're not involved in this NPT P5 dialogue process. So the very fact that they've actually said it is something we can build upon. We can say, well, that's good that you've said that. Now let's make that happen. Let's ensure that a nuclear war is never fought. What are some of your policies that are leading to a possibility that nuclear weapons could be used by crisis escalation, by miscalculation, even by accident? And the accident one, they are, attempting to address, but the crisis escalation one, they're not. that's part of what should be in the strategic stability dialogue, to ensure that crises never escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. We need to put a marker, the marker in the sand is we're not going to move to the use of nuclear weapons. Their sole purpose should be to deter the use of nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. That's where no first use and sole purpose are pretty close. They're not exactly the same. Mm-hmm. But it's from the military and political policy side, it's a little easier to put forward sole purpose. But when you're trying to sort of get public support for it, or congressional support, public support or media, it's a little easier to say no first use, because people understand what no first use means. It means no one's going to fire first with nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. But for the military and policy planners, sole purpose may be a little easier for them to advance at this stage, and maybe move to a full no first use policy later. So that's playing out at the moment with the US Nuclear Posture Review. Mm-hmm. The no first use sole purpose. This is something that we should give a lot of attention to. Yeah. This is something where it's possible to move forward. This is something where you don't immediately have to address the weapon systems, but if you can manage to move on sole purpose and no first use, it makes it much easier then to have some incremental nuclear disarmament steps. Mm-hmm. And one example, and this has been proposed by Dan Ellsberg from the United States, and Bill Perry. Dan Ellsberg is the whistleblower. Used to work for the government, and then blew the whistle on the Pentagon Papers and the secret war in Southeast Asia. So Dan Ellsberg's quite well known on this, but he had been a nuclear weapons planner through the RAND Corporation, looking at what are the different plans for use of nuclear weapons. So he has put forward the idea, and backed up by William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, that if you don't have a first use option, if you decide you don't need a first use option, if the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter from someone else's nuclear weapons, then for the US, they don't need intercontinental ballistic missiles. Mm-hmm. They could get rid of them all. Mm-hmm. And just rely on like the submarine launched ballistic missiles, and in reserve, you have the nuclear bombers. And the reason for this, they say, is that, and I would agree with that assessment, is that the ICBMs are the ones that are on high alert, ready to be fired within minutes, on launch, on warning, because both Russia and the United States still have first use policies. So they need a weapon system that's ready to either launch a preemptive attack if they think first use is coming, or if a first use has been launched, to fire straight away. Yeah. And not wait until you've been hit. You need the ICBMs for that. Yeah. If both Russia and the United States say we're not going to have first use option, it means they can then stand down the forces. They don't have to be on high alert, ready to be fired within minutes, because the only purpose of them is to possibly respond if there is a nuclear attack. The ICBM ones are the most vulnerable anyway. They're the ones that a preemptive first strike could take out. But if there's no preemptive first strike, then there's really no need for them. And you can still rely on your submarines. So that's just one example. There are other examples that if you move on the policy side, you're also helping to rebuild the trust. Yeah. The declaratory policy doesn't do it by itself, but the declaratory policy would then make it easier, as I said, for adopting to de-alert, take the weapons off alert, to eliminate the launch on warning policy. That would then create a decreased tension and help build some more trust between the two countries, and that would then help pave the way to moving on some of these other issues. So those are some things I think that are probably more important than a treaty that looks at the specific weapon systems. I think the declaratory policy is probably more important. I think moving on the declaratory policy is something which can help build more trust, and I think can open the way to more easily then work on the weapon systems.
Yeah, hopefully. Thank you. I see we're actually out of time. So
okay.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you, Anastasiia.
Perfect and very informative and very pleasant. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Okay, thank you. And all the best with your research.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You too.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
And this will be all from me. Thank you very much for your attention. Please make sure to check out the other episodes in the series created by my colleagues, and stay safe and stay optimistic.